Yeah, my name is Bill Tuttle. I'm a retired professor of American Studies and History at the University of Kansas. I'm well known, I think, most of all for a book I wrote called Race Riot, Chicago in the Red Summer of 1919, which was my first book, published in 1970, published again in 1996 in the new edition, and still in print and still selling. It's used in quite a few history courses around the country. I became interested in Black history for a number of reasons, but first of all, I grew up in Detroit in the 1940s and 1950s. Detroit was becoming a majority Black city at that point, but I lived in a white world. I went to a white high school. It was a large public high school. It was all white except for two Chinese American girls who were twin sisters. Other than that, and I went to college at Denison University in Ohio, which was largely white as well. And it wasn't really until I got into the Air Force after college, I became the training officer for a bomb wing for 3 years. And at that point, and in the Air Force, I met many African Americans, including a number of people who became very, very dear friends. One of these was a captain, he's a B-52 pilot, named Woody Farmer. Woody and I became good buddies. We sometimes sit around and drink a bottle of bourbon and listen to jazz records and just talk about our lives and loves. And it was a wonderful experience. But tragically, in 1961, a plane that he was piloting, B-52, crashed in North Carolina. He was killed. I'd also become a good friend of his wife, now his widow. And I was so impressed by the number of Black pilots who flew into the base, family members who came into the base, and I became so impressed by the strength of Black family networks and other networks. And I also, my commanding officer was African American, Captain Dave Taylor, and we became very dear friends. We shot pool together every day and caught up on the news and talked a lot about civil rights. So when I got to graduate school in Madison in 1962, I knew that I wanted to study Black history. And those were the reasons why. I decided to study the Chicago Race Riot because Chicago's only about a 2-hour drive from Madison. Also, her and her family had lived on the south side of Chicago in Hyde Park. My grandfather was a doctor in Chicago. And both my mother and my father were graduates of the University of Chicago. So I knew a little bit about the city, and I also knew about the race riot. So I began to go down to Chicago from Madison for 2 years and wrote my master's thesis on the Chicago race riot. But at that point, I had an opportunity which I didn't want to pass up, and that was to work for James Bryant Conant, who was the Harvard president from 1933 to 1953. He was writing his memoirs, and he wanted to hire a young graduate student, a doctoral student, to help him with this. So I moved to Washington, D.C. with my family. By that time, I had 2 and soon 3 children living in Washington. I wanted to live there. I also thought working for Dr. Conant would probably help me get a good job someplace, including possibly in the White House, because he was very close to the Kennedy administration. So I worked for James Conant for 2 years. He also was a chemist, but he was also the man who helped to mobilize science for World War II. And that meant radar and other developments, some health developments, but above all, it meant the atomic bomb. And he was one of the 3 men in America who knew every aspect of the atomic bomb project. And so I thought that would be very helpful as well. So I did my dissertation on Conant. I put down the Chicago book for 3 years, 2 years, going on 3 years. In '67, I was offered a job as an assistant professor of history at Kansas. And so my family and I moved out here. I talked to the chairman of the department because I was hired to be the Truman Eisenhower scholar because we have 2 presidential libraries nearby. But I told him that I just received a book contract to do a book on the Chicago race riot. Would it be okay if I took a couple of years off from the Truman Eisenhower project to do the book on the Chicago race riot? He said, fine. So from '67 to '69, I did research. And as many of you will recall, this was a period of extreme racial violence in America, beginning with the Watts riot in 1965, horrible racial riots in in Newark, Ohio, Newark, New Jersey, and in Detroit in 1967. And then when Dr. Martin Luther King was murdered in 1968, there were riots in various cities across the country. I was doing my research in Chicago and in Washington, both of which had suffered race riots in the aftermath of King's killing. And so these things were going on at the same time I was doing my research. Also during 1968, of course, Senator Robert Kennedy was murdered. And so that became a part of the backdrop of my research as well. In 1968, when I was back in Washington doing research, the followers of Dr. King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference had organized a project called Resurrection City, the Poor People's Campaign. So while I was doing research on the race riots and such, and let me also mention that the title of my book is Chicago in the Red Summer of 1919, because there were 24 race riots in 1919 in Omaha, in Washington, all over the country, including one race riot in rural Arkansas, which resulted in the deaths of 200 African Americans, 200 people. So I knew this was an important project. So I contextualized the Chicago race riot within the other happenings in 1919, including, again, the Red Summer of 1919. So when I got back to this project in 1968 and 69, I was doing research again in Chicago and Washington. I also was interviewing people, and I had the opportunity to talk to several people who were in Chicago in 1919. And this was kind of an interesting story because I was interviewing the daughters of Ida B. Wells Barnett, who was a well-known civil rights activist, a Black woman in Chicago, and before that in Memphis, a very important figure in the civil rights movement, talking to her daughters. And they said, would I be interested in interviewing a man who was at the scene in 1919 when the Chicago race riot erupted? And I said, absolutely. His name was John Turner Harris. He was a 14-year-old boy at the time. He was with 4 or 5 other boys on a raft that they had built floating in Lake Michigan. They were not good swimmers, but as long as they held onto the raft, they were fine. So they had constructed this raft out of boards that they found. They were floating out in Lake Michigan when a hostile white man started throwing rocks at them, thinking that they were somehow trespassing on a beach that was supposed to be for whites only. One of the rocks hit a man named Eugene, a boy actually, another 14-year-old named Eugene Williams, hit him on the head with a rock. He sank into the water, blood coming up, and he drowned, and he was killed. He was murdered by this man. And when there was a Chicago police officer nearby, the police department was largely Irish American, largely white, and this man refused to arrest the rock thrower. And this is when the riot started on the south side of Chicago, behind the Michael Reese Hospital at 29th Street. The riot went on for several days. 38 people were killed, hundreds were wounded. But again, it was an important part of the Red Summer of 1919. I very much enjoyed this project. I enjoyed working in Black history, but I also thought I should get back to my project with Dr. Conant because I'd written my dissertation on him. So I went back to that for a while, but I never lost my love of Black history. And in 1968, I taught the first course in Black history at the University of Kansas. It was a marvelous course. 24 students, 12 Black, 12 white. I was allowed to select my own student body, so that's quite unusual, I think. But that's what I did. 12 Blacks, 12 whites. And we had amazing discussions over that semester. And so I never really lost my interest in Black history. I also became very much interested in something called history from the bottom up. And a colleague and I, David Katzman and I, put together a book called Plain Folk, The Life Stories of Undistinguished Americans, which came out in the early 1980s, dealing with people whose lives were largely overlooked by historians, but lives which were nevertheless important. So including a man who worked in a white man, an immigrant who worked in the stockyards during this period, and others as well. So we did that. And again, I continued to teach Black history. I continued to go to the Black history meetings, the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. I also decided at one point that maybe I should do another project, and this was totally different. And that resulted in a book called Daddy's Gone to War, the Second World War and the Lives of America's Children. And in that book, I tried to put together social history, in which I specialized, with developmental psychology. And I was awarded a year fellowship by the University of Kansas to study developmental psychology. And the next year I had a fellowship at Stanford to continue these studies. So again, what I was trying to put together was a combination of social history and developmental psychology. And again, the book was called Daddy's Gone to War. I figured out that it was not only important what happened in a person's life, and I was studying World War II, not only what happened during World War II, but what age they were when these events occurred to them. And I thought about my own situation, where I think I was 4 or 5 years old when my father went off to war. He was an army surgeon serving in North Africa, Italy, France, and Germany. And I knew that I had an older sister and a younger brother, and I knew that these events of the war had affected all of us, but really quite differently. My sister was 3 years older, my brother was 3 years younger, and this had a differential impact on us then, and also in our lifespans subsequently after the war as well. The Race Riot book that I wrote, again, that was published in 1970, dealt with a number of different variables. I thought, after these interviews that I did, including with John Turner Harris, I also interviewed a man who was the chief red cap at the Illinois Central Railroad Station, who told me gripping and moving stories about the migrants coming from the Deep South to Chicago during the war to work in the stockyards and the steel mills. And again, those interviews were very, very important. And so I also got involved, not too much, but a little bit. There was a film made called The Killing Floor, based on my Race Riot book, which was a study again of the Black migration from Chicago, the Great Migration during World War I, and then the labor conditions in the stockyards and race relations in the stockyards. And this film was very, very helpful, I think, and was shown widely around the country. I continued to teach at the University of Kansas for many years. I eventually became part of the American Studies program here, but I also had the opportunities to spend a year at Harvard, a year at Johns Hopkins, where I wrote the Race Riot book, a year at Stanford, a year at Berkeley, and these were wonderful experiences. But I always came back to Lawrence. I married a native Kansan, and she's my beloved wife to this day. And so Kansas has always been important to me. We raised our 4 children in Lawrence, and they all graduated from the University of Kansas. And so again, it was important for me to stay here and to become a part of this community. Again, back to the Race Riot book briefly, a lot of it had to do with race relations in the stockyards, but also there was interracial competition for housing, and Blacks who moved into formerly all-white neighborhoods were bombed out in many situations. There were two dozen bombings that occurred in these neighborhoods during World War I, and other hostile actions against Blacks moving into once all-white neighborhoods. Interestingly, politics was also an important cause of the racial violence in 1919. Most African Americans were Republicans at that point. Many other people were Democrats, including Irish Americans. And there was a great deal of hostility generated by politics in Chicago during World War I and later on as well. So housing, politics, labor, and another element was police brutality, which we, of course, have learned a lot about since then, but it was a very important part of the backdrop of the Chicago Race Riot. Most of the police force was white and was very hostile to Black people. As I said earlier, I grew up in Detroit. And when I grew up there, the city was becoming all black, but the police department was 85% white. And I had fellow high school graduates who became police officers, one of whom became a killer of black people. He and his partner would go down to after-hours joints in the black neighborhoods of Detroit, station one man out behind the house, one man in front of the house, who would knock on the front door and say, "Police, open up." And as police did enter the house, the black people who were partying at that point ran out the back door, where the man behind the house, fully armed, shot them to death. And this high school friend of mine was very much involved in these killings. He was later indicted for various crimes and eventually ended up in the Jackson State Penitentiary in Michigan. And so again, the issue of racial violence became an important part of my growing up and also an important part later on. Some of you know there was a race riot in 1943 in Detroit. My mother became quite concerned about our safety. My father, again, was overseas serving in the Army. She was living alone with her 3 children, and she was very much afraid of being assaulted by black people. So I knew that this was a concern of hers. We had a flag which we had flown in the house, indicating that my father was in the military and was overseas. She took that down because she didn't want anybody to know that there was not a man in the household. So this was important. And then in 1967, when I came to KU, there was another race riot in Detroit, and I mentioned this earlier, an extremely bloody race riot. So these are some of the thoughts that I have regarding my book, again called Race Riot, Chicago in the Red Summer of 1919. I also, as I said, did other books, Plain Folk, The Life Stories of Undistinguished Americans, Daddy's Gone to War, The Second World War and the Lives of America's Children. But I also became involved in a large project to rewrite the history of the United States. There were 6 of us involved in this. We wrote the book for Houghton Mifflin Publishers in Boston. It became known as A People and a Nation, and it became the best-selling textbook in American history, and also had a tremendous influence, I think very positive, on the teaching of American history, because we concluded that the history of the U.S. could be taught 2 ways: from the top down, from the presidency and captains of industry and other leading national figures, but also from the bottom up, from the shop floor, from the neighborhood level. And we try to do both things again in A People and a Nation. And it really caught on, and they had quite a positive influence on the teaching of American history and also on the writing of other histories, because soon after our book came out, others came out trying to do the same thing. And we were very pleased with that.